Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. A week after the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy harassed a U.S. Navy warship as well as a Coast Guard patrol craft, President Trump today tweeted that he had told the Navy to destroy Iranian boats, ships, and aircraft that threaten U.S. forces. Joining us now is Brian McGrath, a retired United States Navy commander who commanded the guided missile destroyer USS Bulkley. He's a naval strategist and now leads the Ferry Bridge Consultancy. Brian, thanks as always for joining us.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
And before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our cyber coverage overall. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America is sponsoring our virtual coverage of the Quad A trade show, as well as SOFIC. And Bell, of course, sponsors this podcast. Brian, let's talk a little bit about the tweet and the debate that it sparked. Obviously, in naval circles, there's been a lot of discussion on how the United States should respond to these provocations. One group says it's really overdue to put a marker down, and in fact, it's time for the United States to start bloodying some noses as opposed to being humiliated in international waters. Others, including Representative Elaine Luria, who is a retired United States Navy commander, says, look, if these are hollow threats, then it's actually more dangerous to U.S. national security, and that we have processes, procedures, rules of engagement that are highly sophisticated. Effectively, when other nations are being irresponsible, we're the adults in the room. We always have to be responsible. Is it time to be doing something differently, ultimately?
It is, in my view, long past time. The Iranians, for decades, have done various levels of chicanery to our ships as they move in and out of the Arabian Gulf. But the last 10 years, the nature of that chicanery has got. They used to just sort of follow us. They used to sort of just shadow us and be close. For the last 10 years, they've been doing a lot of dangerous maneuvering close aboard. They have their crew served weapons manned and not pinned in place, but actually ready to be used. They have for years been patterning or shaping our behavior in such a way that Representative Luria, who you just cited in her statement on this thing, just sort of like, oh, they do this all the time. This is just what they do. We have to recognize that. We in this country, those of us who have been against the president, one of the things that we have said is that he violates norms of conduct. There are norms of international conduct. There are norms and laws that govern how ships operate around each other in open waters. And those norms are designed to limit confrontation and to ensure that goods travel unmolested across the seas. And so when those norms are threatened, and they are threatened by this conduct, the United States should contest that. It hasn't been doing it. Now, the president, in his tweet, which we can get to in more detail later, has caused most people to believe that the only thing the ships can do is to sink those ships and kill Iranian people. That's not true. There's lots of stuff we can do. We can fire warning shots. We can shoulder those ships. We can steam straight at them. We can put them on the defensive without necessarily atomizing those people and those ships. We have not routinely been doing those kinds of things, and I think it's long past time that we step up our own responses to this aggression.
And I should note that we have fired warning shots in the past, so that's not something that's.
We have fired warning shots, and they have not been very well received up the chain of command.
So let's talk a little bit about this new tweet, because it's not particularly clear, right? I mean, there's some debate about whether this is messaging to the Iranians, hey, stop messing with us, and does not necessarily maybe reflect guidance or anything else. part of the debate is whether or not this sends a negative and potentially confusing chain of command signal to folks in the chain of command, right? We lost an acting Navy secretary in part because he fired the commanding officer of the Theodore Roosevelt because he thought that's what that President Trump would have wanted him to do. There are those who fear that, does the captain not want to fire, but somebody who's manning the 50 cal decide to fire, thinking, hey, well, that's what the president would want me to do. And oh, by the way, he'll come to my aid anyway, and I won't get court-martialed. I mean, what's the right way to think about this, or is all of that stuff just baloney?
No, it's not baloney. It's the sort of, there is signaling here. There is signaling from the president to the Iranians that he is unhappy with the conduct. They're signaling to his base here in the United States that probably appreciates a little bit of red meat getting thrown to them. And they like when the president talks like that, and they think that it's really good that he does it. If I were the CEO of a DDG in the Arabian Gulf right now, everybody on my ship would understand that orders to shoot come from me, or they come from other or people that I deputize within the skin of the ship.
What would your guidance be to sailors on the deck plates who are reading this, right? I mean, you mentioned the importance of having that conversation as a command, but sort of in a more succinct way. What would you tell them?
In that capacity, he's a political figure and he was making a political statement. He is the commander in chief. And if a series of orders come down from him to change the way that we are ordered to do business, we will do so. We have not received those orders. Respond to mine. That's the kind of clarity that the commanding officers have to pass to their crews, and that, quite frankly, the chain of command from CENTCOM to Fifth Fleet to Task Force 50 on down ought to be passing to the ships there.
When you said shouldering, I like that. The Cold War guy in me remembered Karen and a number of other times when American and Russian ships, for example, traded paint. What's the right way for the United States to respond to a number of these increasing provocations, right? I mean, it's not just Iranians with their bog hammers and things like that buzzing around and annoying people. The Russians are doing things that are also highly provocative, and in fact, you could argue significantly more or as dangerous, with high-speed aircraft coming in close proximity to ships that are steaming in international waters. The Chinese are being increasingly aggressive, whether or not it's marshaling their auxiliary fishing fleets or 14,000-ton Coast Guard cutters. What's sort of the right way for the United States to be responding to these increasing provocations?
The United States should be responding to these provocations with at least two guiding principles. And the first guiding principle is that there is a norm or a set of norms that are worth defending. And number two, that the defense of that norm has to be flexible to the individual circumstance. So let's start with the first part. The norm, as we discussed earlier, is the safe navigation of ships at sea. The Iranians are contesting that. The United States should take additional actions up to and including shooting at them or sinking them, in order to demonstrate to the Iranians that the norm that the Iranians are violating is one that is important to us, and that we will risk certain things in order to show them that it is important to us. One of the things that I've found on social media today is this sense that our response options don't exist, because if we decide to run down a few of these guys or come with a hard left rudder while they're close aboard on the port side, that somehow that is going to be the thing that touches off the war with Iran. That may be the case. I think that is highly unlikely. The fact it has any possibility causes so many people to be paralyzed to think about other things that we can do. And I think there are, as I said, there are a range of things. There are more more aggressive use of warning shots, shouldering and running the ships down, buzzing them with our helicopters. There's all sorts of interesting things that we could do to step up the pressure on them, but we don't do that. We tend to contest ourselves by the Marquess of Queensberry rules. We're going to do this clean. We're going to do this the Representative Luria way, which is we just recognize that it's a cost of doing business. Quite frankly, I disagree.
Just to point out that Representative Luria, who is a retired United States Navy commander, points out that sometimes restraint is the greatest show of strength ultimately. And that's been a policy that the United States has adopted, I think, for very many decades, even if, as you point out, it leads to bad behavior on our part of potentially not confronting these threats. At the end of the day, what is the value of putting out press releases, right? We have a tendency of putting press releases out where we disclose the incident and saying, look, this was irresponsible, bad behavior. Here's the video of the ships buzzing us. I know Admiral Jamie Fogo, the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe, has used that to great effect with Russians in sort of being like, hey, here's the videotape of you guys being highly unsafe and you guys look like a bunch of morons. How about policing your behavior? Should we be announcing every time one of these incidents happen?
Well,
Because I think we do it to be open, right?
This gets back to the second principle that I was describing earlier, which is that we have to take these circumstances individually. Because Iran is violating norms, and I am advocating that we should take a more aggressive stance thereunto, does not mean that I think we should start shooting down flankers when they buzz us in the Black Sea, or that we should be taking Type 55s under fire in the South China Sea. One does not follow the other. The norm has to remain important to us. The protection and the sustainment of the norm has to remain in our minds, but the means that we take to contest the norm violations are in no small part a measure of how much strength does the other country have. Is it worth shooting a Chinese destroyer in the South China Sea who might be operating unsafely around the U.S. destroyer? That's one risk calculation that takes place in that situation. The risk calculation about shouldering or potentially taking Iranian ships under fire is a separate risk calculation. In both cases, we have to support the norm. When you have a norm violator like China or Russia, who has considerable more power than Iran does, then you are left with fewer options. And some of those options are go to the international press, show the videotapes, file the démarches, go to the appropriate UN committee that might handle such things. You have fewer options with China and Russia than you have with Iran. And so that's one of the reasons that I am advocating using some of those more options with Iran rather than treating Iran like China or Russia.
If you were going to put together a McGrath doctrine, what does the McGrath doctrine look like?
Number one, you have to protect the norm. Number two, you have to have a set of responses that are tailored to the particular norm violator. When people say that restraint is the greatest strength, in some cases that's true. Putting a bit of stick about now and then is also important so that the norm remains the norm. And that's what we're trying to do, make sure that goods flow freely through the Strait of Hormuz and in the Persian Gulf for everyone, for all trading nations, not just us or Iran.
And I know that this is something that we have been talking about practicing more, shouldering, coming into contact, right? I mean, those were things that for the longest time were more than somewhat anathema for American warship captains. There were some who were very good ship handlers who felt confident doing it. There are others who may feel not as confident. And as a general rule, the notion of trading paint is always somewhat frowned upon as generally a career-ending evolution. Are we spending enough time training, preparing doctrinally from a command and control standpoint on how we best handle this sort of thing given that our adversaries are going to put us in a position to do that?
That's a really good question, and it has me thinking about the just how good our ship handling trainers are, and could we in fact do a better job with sort of digital representations of these kinds of things in a way that we could train to do this? Because quite frankly, I don't have a clue. I've never shouldered anybody. I've never had the order to do it or the need to do it. But I tell you that if I were in the Arabian Gulf right now and I remember what it was like, I'm not that old. I still remember what it was like to be in command. And I was told that you should, that you have the ROE that says you can shoulder. I would do it, and and I would and I don't think that I would be afraid to do it. I think that it would be something that makes a lot of sense. You are 9,000 tons. He is 50 tons maximum. There is an inequity there that works to your advantage, and I would use it.
Although I will say, Brian, that you were such an expert ship handler that I think you would have handled it with extreme aplomb if you came alongside in the finest traditions of the United States Navy.
Although it would have been one of the most serious things that I had ever done in my life, I can guarantee you I would have had fun doing it.
Brian, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.